We all know that our politicians are on social media and they're there to communicate with the people. Now, because they're public servants, they should be openly communicating with the people, not that they have to respond to everything. But part of being a public servant is you're accessible to the public. And so that allows people to communicate with you, to criticize you, to say positive or negative things about you. And as a public servant, you just have to take it. That's part of the job. Now, it was ruled a while ago that Trump could not block people on Twitter because he was a public servant and he was open to criticism. AOC has now blocked someone called Alex Stein. He's a bit of a troll. He's a libertarian conservative type. And this is a big violation to AOC in terms of breaking the Constitution. Like, you're a public servant and we have the First Amendment. Now, this is not prosecution on this private citizen, but it's more of a critique on, if you're a public servant, you need to be accessible to the public. You cannot arbitrarily or artificially select people to kick off or block just because you don't like what they're saying about you, whether it's mockery, whether it's a parody, whether it's something positive, something extremely negative. We may not have to condone it or agree with it, but if you're a public servant, you need to be accessible to the public. Again, you don't have to reply, but you have to face that criticism. If people are tweeting at you, that's part of the job. Now, this is extremely important because if you have our politicians who don't understand the Constitution, don't understand their role of being a public servant, it shows that what else are they doing at an incompetent level? Or if they are competent, it's out of malice, okay? They don't have your best interest. If we look at someone like AOC, if we look at someone like Mitch McConnell, okay, so these are one person on the left, one person on the right. These are both establishment people. What that means simply is there's different types of people, but there's one agenda, one goal. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right. Now, there are more people on the left who are part of the establishment, and there are less people on the right who are part of the establishment, but generally speaking, the majority of them are part of the establishment. And they're part of the establishment. They've been recruited to the establishment in many different variations. It could be, here's some money. It could be more complex than that. I'm just giving a basic example. But when you look at someone like AOC or Mitch McConnell, they just care about moving the agenda forward. Now, AOC may move it more dramatically, more radically. Mitch McConnell may move it at a slower pace, maybe at a turtle's pace, but he's still moving it. He may wear a tie with the Ukraine flag on it and still advocate for the war in Ukraine because he has donors and interests that want him to push the Ukraine war because it's part of a proxy war, a conflict that many other different corporations, politicians, and different interests behind the scenes all profit from. So it really doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right. Oftentimes these people are part of the system. They're pawns themselves, okay? So you can have the general public be pawns to a larger agenda, but you can also have politicians, elected officials who are part of the agenda. They're also pawns. You can also have unelected officials. So an example of this might be you elect the president through a constitutional republic. That's what we do. And then the president appoints someone as a CIA director. So we didn't directly appoint that CIA director, but we indirectly appointed him. So he's an unelected official. He's part of the executive branch, part of the CIA, okay? So all of these people can have the potential to be pawns, and in fact, most of the time they are pawns. Who are not the pawns? The pawns, the people who are not the pawns, are the people who have been behind the administrative state for decades. These are people who have worked there since they're 20, 30, or, they could have gotten in there when they're 40, 50, but regardless, they're in there for decades. You have a CIA director who can be changed at a whim based off the president. You have the president who's a temporary employee, 4 to 8 years, sometimes less, depending on certain circumstances. The same thing with elected officials. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing that they have term limits, because it could go either way. If you remove term limits or if you have term limits, it could go either way. But it's really the conglomeration of these different parties within an entire system that attribute to our system being corruptible. I mean, it's already been corrupted, but if we go back to 1776, it would have been envisioned that it would be corruptible. So you had certain checks and balances that were in place. So now the goal of people who chase power, and they're coming out of malice, objectively they're coming out of malice, but they think they have good intentions or a proper ideology, they will come in and they'll find ways to exploit the system to control the checks and balance system. So let's say you're part of the executive branch. The checks and balance system at a very basic aerial level would be the judicial or the legislative branch checking the executive branch. Now, if you control the majority of the three branches, you control the checks and balances. And so you control basically the direction of the country. Now, there are plenty systems designed, plenty tactics designed in the system to create gridlock. So like in Congress, it's designed to be a gridlock. You can have two parties. They should not agree, generally, on most occasions, to pass a law, because generally when you pass more laws, you're generally going against the Constitution. The Constitution is coming from a very libertarian and slight conservative point of view, generally more libertarian. And when you pass laws, you're forcing restriction upon private citizens or private businesses. So we do have gridlock systems. We do have tactics and strategies in place that were designed from the beginning, but a lot of the design was not put in place or not thought of in 1776 and thereafter. And so, for example, if you have the legislative branch, they have Capitol Police, but they don't really have that much Capitol Police. All of the force lies within the executive power. So if you're, and it's not like if you're the president, you can become a dictator, because the president himself, especially in modern history, has been useful as a pawn towards the establishment. Again, they're a temporary employee. And there's one way to get around that. Maybe I'll get to that. But generally, when you're put into these positions, you're at the whim of people who are actually controlling these different institutions. And if you have all the force in the executive branch, and you're the legislative branch, and you're trying to check the executive branch, but you only have a few Capitol Police against FBI, CIA, DOD, DOJ. I mean, you have so many different departments under the executive branch that were not capped through the Constitution. The executive branch can overrule you as a legislative branch, even if those malicious powers only have the executive branch. Let's say you have good powers at the legislative and the judicial branch. These two separate branches don't have any power, and what wins at the end of the day is force. Now, I would advocate against force. Hopefully, we want to encourage a meritocratic system, but when you're dealing with people who are malicious, who just care about power, who want to chase status at the top of hierarchies, and they want to control the people, and they want to make sure that they have labor and resources allocated towards their ideology, once they get their hands on force, which happens in any dictatorship, it's pretty much game over. There's no checks and balances. Now, in a constitutional republic like our nation, a more democratic system, or just democratic nations in general, there has to be more tact. It's a little bit more covert. It's less overt. When you're in a more destabilized region of the world, it's easier to be overt with action than it is to be covert. There's a lot less restriction, a lot less barriers. Now, with this AOC thing, why is it that, whether you think AOC is smart, malicious, ignorant, whatever, why is she blocking someone who's just criticizing her? It wasn't really a criticism. It was more of like a parody, kind of mocking thing, a little bit of a comedy drama. There are barriers that are put in place at every level, from people at the top to people below them. Even if you're the middle class, upper middle class, it doesn't really matter. These barriers could be something as simple as blocking you on Twitter, which we've already just talked about, but it could be something more like passing regulation to prevent a small cap business, using stock market terms, a small cap business from competing with a large cap business. Or it could be a law that restricts your First Amendment right to protest, so that you as a government employee don't have to face any kind of criticism. And so there are different ways through force, because how are laws enforced? Through force. There are different ways, different tactics that the upper echelon will use, the large majority of the upper echelon will use to protect themselves at the top of the hierarchy, because they don't want anyone to criticize them or compete with them. Because what they fear the most is when you criticize them. When you criticize them, you expose all of the bad that they're doing. You expose all of the incompetence, the corruption, the backroom deals. This is happening over there. This is happening over there. This is a distraction. They're doing this on purpose. This is unintentional. This is intentional. You expose what they're really doing. And when you're if you're empathetic for a second and you put yourself in their shoes, if you are at the top of the hierarchy, what would your instinct be? It would be to protect yourself, to secure yourself, because you have people who are depending on you, you're depending on yourself, and you enjoy not only the status, but the wealth, the resources, the access to conveniences and amenities. And you will conjure up ideas on how to protect yourself, even if it means overstepping other people, because at that point, you're so self-interested, you can't be empathetic enough to understand that you may be in someone else's shoes, because you just see, you're solipsistic. You only see yourself in your shoes. You can't see other people in their shoes. And so you don't see that, it's not a mirroring effect, but you don't see their perspective. Imagine if you were not in that position of being high in status, which most people are not. You would be empathetic enough to understand that I should have a voice to criticize my politicians. But generally, when you're a politician and you were chasing that position because it's about power and you're a tad bit sociopathic, you don't really care. You don't really have an interest for the people, even though that's your entire role as a public servant. And so we see a lot of these public servants who come in, they may make, $100,000 to $200,000 a year, let's say you're in Congress, but your net worth after couple decades is over, it's in the tens of millions, if not more. So we need to calculate, how is this possible if you only have X salary? Sure, I mean, you have the freedom and option to start a business, but what is your business? If you look into it, you don't have a business. You were doing something else on the side, and that was covered up. And so we see that these people in power, they have the ability to make our lives better and easier just by getting rid of regulation, getting rid of laws, not being in the way. Okay, they don't need to go out of their way to do something for us. They just need to make sure they don't partake in an authoritarian control or takeover of our nation. But they want to feed themselves, not at a basic level, but they want to be gluttons. Okay, they want to fatten themselves up. They want more than they need. They want to hoard resources. There's nothing wrong with hoarding resources, but if you do it at a corrupt level, that's a problem, because now you have collateral, and that collateral is our individual rights as private citizens. And if we can't even criticize you, what is the purpose? Every other nation in the world, you can't criticize the government. Here we can. We have the First Amendment, but we're starting to slowly see that even criticizing our elected officials, which is the entire point of the system that we have in a constitutional republic, even that is being degraded.